Hello, I'm Deborah Malone, founder of The Internationalist and host of Internationalist Marketing TV. Today's guests are Geoff Tuff and Stephen Goldbach, both principals at Deloitte and co-authors of Hone. Well, Steve, Geoff, it is a wonderful pleasure to invite you to the show because you're talking about something that I really feel that business people need to understand better. So I'm excited to welcome you. So welcome to the show, both of you.
Thank you, Deb.
Thanks.
It's great to be here. Yeah.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah, no.
And actually
wonderful.
together for once.
Yeah, we don't get
Steve
to
and I
do
are
this together.
usually in different places, and we get to do this together.
I am making a reconnection here. So that in itself is a historic moment. So let's go on. I'm just going to jump in with something that might seem very obvious, but why Hone? Now, after years of urging companies to detonate and to provoke, what inspired you to focus on shall we call it, the power of steady refinement? It seems like a very different form of energy.
Yeah, so why don't I actually take you on a little bit of the journey that we've been on, Deb, and then I'll ask Steve to talk specifically about the reason we chose this title. But as you mentioned, our first book that came out probably 8 or 9 years ago was called Detonate. It was quite a hyperbolic term, I think, but we chose that term very purposely because at least one definition to detonate or detonation is controlled demolition. And the idea that we had at the time was that too many companies were resting on their laurels and resting on, and our audience we write to a lot of the time are big scaled, successful organizations and executives at those organizations. And the concern that Steve and I had was that with increasing change and acceleration of change, companies were too stuck in the way that they had historically done things in order to become successful. And so the idea that we wanted to get out into the world is, look, it's time to, on occasion, pick up your head, challenge the playbooks, blow some things up, and try to reinvent in different ways than reinvention typically happened at the time. And thankfully, that book was well received. It gave us enough confidence to then move on and write the next book, Provoke, which is all about after you've done those controlled demolitions, the detonations, and you've established a new way of operating, then you need to look to the future and provoke a future in which you have advantage with your new operating model. And so that was really a forward-looking book that, again, was well received. And for our sins, we are here talking about our third book together. And that we really wanted to land in a place that was all about, once you've blown up the old ways of doing things, provoke the right future, how do you manage day in, day out to make sure that you stay on track as you head towards and then through that future?
Yeah, and picking it up from there, Deb, I think the idea of Hone emerged from a conversation that I had with a chef friend of mine, Flannery Colton. And she's the subject of chapter 1, and we profile 4 different artisans in the book, as you know. I observed that Flannery, every time before she would start cooking, would, what I thought was, sharpen her knives. And I asked her, why does she do that? And she said, and I used the word sharpening, and she said, well, no, Steve, I'm not sharpening my knife, I'm honing it. And I'm like, yeah, honing, sharpening, what's the difference? And she's like, completely different. Honing is about realigning the steel in the blade to cut the way it was meant to cut the last time it was sharpened. But when you sharpen a knife, you actually have to remove steel from the blade. It's a destructive act. And what I started to think about then was, and then she said, honing is both a maintenance, so the maintenance of the knife, but it's also a meditation. It's a reminder of why she's doing this. It's like I'm about to start this, job. I'm about to start, and it's a way that she gets herself prepared. And so we thought about that metaphor as it related to business, because so much of what we observe in the world of business today is that we're migrating from one transformation to another. And we thought that there are times, of course, as Geoff described with detonation where that's necessary. But it's such a destructive act, and it's so frequent today. Wouldn't management teams be better off minimizing the need for that? And the way that they can minimize the need for that is by constantly honing their organizations so that they don't have to wait for the problems to build up where transformation is the only solution to that problem. So that's why we chose the word hone for this and as the source of inspiration for the book.
I think it's wonderful. It's probably a word that, to your point, you have to kind of look up to make sure that you fully know precisely what it means. Before we get into more of the book, I'm just curious. I mean, you said, Geoff, that you did the first one, the Detonate one. What did you say, about 9 years ago? So that was pre-COVID, right? So it also feels that the books came at moments in time when there was a need for different actions in this state of constant transformation. I'm not sure if you were thinking of writing a trilogy when you started, but just comment on that just for a second, because it does seem that in the as you said, the migration of transformations, there are different solutions at each time, which is pretty fascinating. It's not going back to the same, create, destroy, destroy, create.
Well, so first of all, Deb, thank you for giving us the benefit of the doubt to assume that we could have envisioned a trilogy. We did not at the beginning. And I'd like to say that we had planned the timing of each of these books as well as it has actually turned out. But again, I wouldn't be telling you the whole truth if that were the case. When we set off on this journey, we had our sights on writing a book that people enjoyed and using a writing style that was easily accessible and actually conveyed some interesting ideas as well. But Detonate, we felt the need to write it at that point in time. We started conceiving of the ideas almost 10 years ago at this point, because that's where we were starting to see the impact of exponential change hitting all the markets that our clients were playing in and the ways and that we serve every single day. And we can come back and talk about the nature of exponential change in a moment if you would like. The interesting thing about Provoke, which came out in 2021, but we actually wrote it entirely during COVID, is unbeknownst to us when we started to write the book, even though it didn't feel like a very confident time, the world gained confidence that they were able to do extraordinary things through the course of COVID and to actually change the trajectory of the future. And I won't take you through a history of COVID. All of us were obviously not feeling particularly confident at the beginning, but as we started to see people radically disassemble the way that they had previously operated and innovate in ways that they had never imagined before, I think our readers became confident that actually some of the things we were recommending around recognizing an uncertainty before it resolves from being a question of if to being a question of when, which was the central premise behind Provoke, that it's actually possible to do those things and that it's possible to act without perfect information. So that really, quite honestly, had COVID not happened, who knows if that book would have landed as well as it did. And then the third one here, Hone, that we've written most recently and just released in late October of 2025, it did feel like the right time to address the hype around transformation. And in this year and last year in particular, AI has been the big driver of discussions around why we need to transform, and it's just it became too much in at least the conversations we were having outside and with our clients and with others in the business world. The whole notion that transformation is acceptable and necessary to progress in the face of whether it's AI or any other significant trend, the chatter was too much, and so we wanted to address that. But as I say, we did not develop a roadmap 9 years ago for all three of these things to land in the way that they have.
But I would say though the common theme, like if you would go back and from a retrospective perspective, and look for what we're trying to do, I think there are two important themes that run through all of our work. One is the criticality of first principles thinking in leading an organization. And Detonate, that first principles thinking, is that best practices are not best practices if everybody does them. They're mediocre, and the importance of differentiation as part of your business model and doing things that don't make sense anymore from a first principles perspective. Provoke is from a first principles perspective about there's a bunch of trends that actually are clear that they're going to come to fruition a lot earlier than most would acknowledge that they recognize, and therefore companies have an opportunity to shape that future more actively if they do so deliberately. And then hone is more of a management philosophy to be doing that on a continual basis. But the principle of always getting back to first principles thinking and never falling prey to the idea that there can be or should be a single playbook for how to run a business, I think is the thing that runs through. And then the second theme is that of the tool to use is behavior change in your customers and your employees. And that's the thing that we try to bring to the forefront in home.
Behavior change, in the world at large, at the mass consumer level. Let me just touch on something. Just quickly tell me your it's hone, and then you have a longer title that involves both purpose and drift. Just tell me what it is, because I have a question about it. Yeah.
So the subtitle is how purposeful leaders defy drift, and we use the term purposeful in sort of a double meaning. Purposeful meaning intent, and sort of in the way Flannery describes her quote as honing as a meditative practice. So I'm being very clear about the behaviors that I want to drive in my organization. But we also think that this can be applied to the world of societal change. And that also needs to have a clear behavioral roadmap. And then the enemy of purposeful leadership is drift. And drift is when we're sort of falling prey to just some operating mindset, a bunch of practices that don't come back to a customer benefit or a community benefit or a benefit to stakeholders. And that's to some extent what we're, that's the enemy in this that we need to overcome.
And it was my insertion of yet another boating metaphor into our writing that led us to the notion drift. But we can go deeper on that if you would like.
Well, maybe we will come back to that. Let me try to segue a little bit, given that our audience are largely marketers. Could we just talk a little bit about what drift looks like when it comes to a brand or marketing culture?
I spend a lot of my time in the energy space these days, and Steve, I would say, is the more professional marketer. But I will say that drift looks similar no matter what your function, no matter what your sector or industry that you work in. And it tends to occur when teams or individuals get into reaction mode and firefighting mode, and essentially they layer on top of what was originally a good strategy and a strong direction, day-to-day reactions to what's happening around them, whether it's because of a customer need shift or a shift into the regulatory framework or a competitive move. They layer on top different actions and different attempts to change management systems to deal with the issue of the moment, and only X number of months down the road pick up their head and say, wow, all that accumulation of those actions and the small tweaks that we've made over time have really not only become quite encumbering, but they've led us off the original track that we'd intended to go down. So if I had to imagine how that manifests primarily in marketing, let's say you have a strong elemental purpose, which is one of the terms we use in the book, behind a campaign or a years-long campaign that you want to run. Every micro adjustment to that campaign, every new messaging that you may want to layer on top, every reaction to a new customer need or a competitive brand's action in the market is going to create some, I would imagine, dissonance in that messaging over time as it builds up. And I could easily see how the whole notion of drift directly applies to marketing when you think about it in the kind of months-long time frame and your ability to stay on message, to stay on track with the original marketing strategy. But Steve, what would you either add or change about that?
The thing that I think from a marketing perspective, when you ask the question, that immediately comes to mind is the drift could also happen in the opposite way, which is we get enamored with something that at one point was relevant, that it's very clear that that relevance has either lost its differential edge or become irrelevant to the customer. And a lot of people like to cite the changes that technology is driving in the world, and we agree with that. And what that tends to change is the customer's perspective of what good looks like. So, let me think of a relevant example. So now there's almost no reason for a fast food restaurant or a quick service restaurant to ever have customers waiting, because it doesn't create a better customer experience. Yet some industries have been slow to leverage, you're ordering on your mobile phone ahead of time so that the customer experience is just better. I can go into a restaurant and pick up my food. Would be considered drift from my perspective, where we're enamored with our model because it's worked for a long time and not reacting to the changes in the world because we don't see them. I think drift is also about ignoring first principles changes going on in the world, particularly with those of your customers. And so you might say there are industries that are adrift. I've often wondered why we haven't seen more dramatic reinventions in the broad-based world of department stores, because the value proposition of a department store that goes back to the 30s, when people could shop, in a single place, and that was a convenience aspect. That convenience is no longer necessary. The selection isn't necessary, and what those businesses are in a cycle of is, figuring out, evolutions of the same model without trying new and different and differentiated ways to be distinctive and create a really cool alternative to online shopping in person. Instead, they're sort of closing stores, cutting costs, and making their old business model even less attractive with that sort of cycle of problems. So I think that's another form of drift, where you're stuck in a business model that doesn't seem to have a way out of it. And I think marketers can get themselves into both models.
So then should the good marketer constantly respond to the subtlest of shifts that they're seeing? If marketers are supposed to be the people who understand their customer behavior and the overall trends, would that be one way of them to continually honing what they're trying to do? And it's interesting because there's a lot of words that you're using that I find fascinating. You mentioned, I think it was Geoff, you mentioned an elemental purpose, and that's interesting because I'm not sure if that's a little bit in conflict with if you're going along and something shifts, but you still stick with it, because unless elemental purpose is one of those things that doesn't change. I'm just curious. Could you just talk about that? Yeah.
Yeah. So elemental purpose is instead of ornamental purpose. Okay, so elemental purpose is why we exist as an organization. Okay. It's not
the old purpose that we loved during COVID. Yeah.
It's not something that should shift, but it should be broad enough that it can withstand the day-to-day evolution of what we do. So if I think about Deloitte's elemental purpose, as someone who served as our chief strategy officer for nearly a decade, I think about it as something that is enduring. We're here to help our clients solve their really, impossible and complex and novel challenges that they face in their business. I think that is a purpose that can withstand the onslaught of changes in technology and changes in the geopolitical environment. But that's what we do at the end of the day. I think marketers have to understand what they're trying to do from their customer's point of view, but then adapt to a world where those needs are distinctive. And yes, sometimes your elemental purpose may have a time frame to it. But for the most part, we think if you're thinking about it in the right way, then you can evolve the way you meet that purpose using different techniques. And yes, constantly honing along the way, because you should be, the most important metric from a marketer standpoint should be to remain relevant in the eyes of their customers. And that relevance, the only way you maintain that relevance is to be really attuned to what it is they want and how you satisfy those needs. And if you're not experimenting, then it's hard to maintain that. What would you add to that?
Well, so there's two things I would add, and I will drag us to the boating metaphor here to help out with this.
I
But
knew, I knew it was coming.
I can't help myself. I'm sorry, but it actually does help explain some of what at least I think about this. So let's imagine your elemental purpose as the course that you have charted for your. Let's say you're out on a sailing adventure. It's the coordinates of where you want to end up. It's a point on land that you're aiming towards, or what have you. Sometimes the most direct way to achieve that course is not by going directly to it. Actually, sometimes in the world of sailing, sometimes it's impossible to sail directly to it because you're heading up into the wind and you need to tack back and forth. And it's the actions that marketers take day in, day out to react to what customers need, how customers' needs are shifting, or what they're being asked for, or what have you, that I think of as being the micro adjustments in the path that over time still heads on the right course, but may not be directly headed towards it. And so you can even think about different campaigns being the different tacks that you're on as you go about achieving your elemental purpose. The other critical thing, though, along the way is that, and this is true for marketing, it's true for any executive trying to hone in their business, is you have to remove the layers of accumulation that came before when appropriate. It doesn't mean you have to constantly be stripping away past messages or past campaigns, but the reality is that the accumulation of the impressions, and I'm trying to put this in marketing language that makes sense, but the accumulation of the impressions that you've made with your customers over time is either a good and consistent thing, or it's a confusing mishmash of different attempts to deal with whatever the issue of the moment might have been. And so the other critical capability that Steve and I write about in Hone is the whole notion of uninstalling management systems, or in the case of marketers, uninstalling certain messaging or branding components over time to make sure that you're working with the cleanest possible system at your availability.
That's interesting, and I'm glad you did do the boating metaphor. And I'm not going to take it further because sometimes marketers may find that the point that they originally wanted to go to is not the point that they halfway down the line that they really want to get to. But that's another thing. A couple of things. You mentioned management systems in the book as the company's nervous system, correct?
Yeah.
Yes.
So just curious then, how does marketing fall into that? Given that they have to do everything, marketing leaders have to do everything from reputation to customer experience to storytelling and so on. And I also would just love at some point to maybe just talk a little bit more about purpose, because that's a very loaded word that might need to be redefined, or maybe another word found for it, because sometimes I think it can be misleading in that some people have one notion of it and the other. So I know that was kind of a multiple question, but just talk a little bit.
Let me start with just the basic what we mean by management systems, and I'll then hand it off to Steve to talk about particularly the implications for marketing. But a management system, in the way that we think about it, is anything at the disposal of leaders in an organization. It can be any leader in any function at any level, but anything at their disposal that can impact human behavior. So that's behavior of employees, it's behavior of customers, it's behavior of suppliers, it's anyone in your extended value chain. Ultimately, we have a very strong belief that change in general doesn't happen, and that includes growth changes, doesn't happen unless some human being somewhere changes their behavior. So ultimately, what you're trying to do with management systems is find the right people to impact whose behavior is actually going to have a positive outcome, and then use management systems to affect that behavior. I think one of the really interesting things for your audience is the strongest behavioralists in most companies, the people who understand the motivators of human behavior and what it takes to drive behavior, are marketers. And so not only can they use the notion of management systems in their own practice, but they actually can be the behavioral voice of reason, if you will, to the rest of the organization. But Steve, how would you think about applying management systems in marketing?
Yeah, I mean, but look, there's two vectors I would frame it up as. One is what management systems need to be put in place for marketers to get their work done inside the organization. So I'll go back to a concept that was in vogue like 15 years ago. Remember, Deborah, the world of integrated marketing, right? Where we named a marketing leader to be responsible for integration, but we didn't give her any budget whatsoever. And we said, just go make things integrated, but we'll do it with,
the silos remained. Yeah.
The silos remain, but you need to do it with influence. That was a poorly designed management system in most organizations because they had this thing they wanted to achieve, which was better marketing integration, but they did not give that leader the tools to integrate at all. They left all the decision rights, all the budgets deep into the silos. And so what we would have said is that if you want better integration, just demand better integration from your marketing leader, right? Like that should be the output, and then design the system so the silos work together. I think, over time we've got there, but that was an example of where management systems could have been used to accelerate the pace with which we got to integrated marketing. In the external world, think about marketing tactics as the management systems to change customer behavior. And so if I want a customer to behave in a different way because that behavior will cause my brand to grow or be preferred, to competition, I've got to find a reason to get my customers to do something that they're either not doing today or do more of tomorrow. And what I'm constantly seeking are the motivators of behavior. And we can motivate behavior by finding something that is a driver, a cause of that behavior, or we can alleviate a barrier to that behavior. Like I don't order from this, trying to think about something simple in my life. Like there's a really great restaurant that we love to go to, but is always busy and they don't take reservations. And we never like to order from them because they take like an hour and a half to deliver. So a barrier would be for them to figure out either a reservation system, or a way to get food to my home faster. But that would be a way that they could grow, but they've got to put in place something that would overcome that. That's what marketers are responsible for. And they've got to figure out what those levers are. That's going to be the cause of that behavior that they want.
Oh, that's very interesting. And you raise a lot of points. I want to get back to something in the book that I personally found fun. And that's your idea of the minimally viable move, which I thought was just so fascinating in a world where, as you say, you like to blow things up, or, you think that the best thing to do is entirely disrupt. Could you apply that to how a marketer should think? Or, sometimes, again, it feels antithetical to what their mission is, but could you just talk about it? And it's tough when people are pressured, to constantly deliver significant results, and there's more responsibility on marketers by the CEO to drive sales.
Yeah, so why don't I set up what a minimally viable move is, or what we mean by it? And I find it on occasion necessary to point out that the notion of controlled detonation and and the notion of a minimally viable move are not two things that are in conflict. They exist side by side, because to be able to make minimally viable moves is the muscle you need to have in order to progress after you've blown up the playbook. So minimally viable moves, as I'm sure anyone can intuit, we borrowed the notion from the idea of minimally viable products and product development. One way to do effective product development, especially when you're operating in a new space or with a new technology, is not to go and develop the whole thing and then launch it to the market. You develop it a little bit, you put it out to the market for feedback, and then you pull it back into the lab or to the bench and you do some more work on it, because if the market liked it, that you continue on down that path. If they didn't like it, you go a slightly different direction. That's an MVP. Everyone knows about that. Early in our partnership together, Steve and I posited that the exact same thinking, the exact same mindset can be applied to any sort of management move, where if we got out of the habit of doing months and months and months of analysis and justification for a move we wanted to make, and instead just boil whatever the management move is down to its smallest testable hypothesis and then go do it and get some feedback from the intended audience, whether you're talking about external moves to customers or internal moves to employees, you're going to be able to work in the face of uncertainty a lot more effectively than if you do the reams and reams of analysis. And so, again, I'll let Steve pick up from here, but I think one of the great things about marketers and their ability to apply that notion in their world is they have the mechanisms to go out and do small test and controls almost better than any other part of the organization, because it's part of what they do as marketers every single day as they're testing out new messaging or new formats or what have you.
And the only thing I'll add to that, Deb, is that therefore, what must be true for marketers to do that is they need to have a hypothesis about what's the behavior they're trying to see if they can change. So I think oftentimes we get these two gross ROI kind of metrics. And what I mean by gross, it's like all we care about is driving sales. And then we come up with these, supposedly sophisticated, but, very, in my opinion, sort of almost too large trying to relate, moves back to sales. And I think that what you need to do is really thin that layer to say, like, what was the behavior we were trying to cause in the world? And then measuring whether you're able to drive that behavior. And it may not be just, I got someone to buy something. It's like, I got someone to go to a store more frequently, or I got someone to shop at a higher price point, or I got this segment of customer to express interest in my product in some way, or sign up for a newsletter, or sign up for any sale can be broken down into a series of different behaviors. And what the marketer is trying to fine tune, or should be trying to fine tune constantly, are those individual behaviors that drive, to an eventual sale, and not just focus on, if I spend, do I get sales? Because to some extent, that's too unsophisticated. What you have to have a theory of is, what are the different behaviors that lead to the sale, and where are you losing in that process, and where do your marketing tactics start to influence something that will end up driving sales in the end.
I understand what you mean, particularly now that we're in a period in marketing where people are balancing more of the brand building side of it with the performance marketing side. I think they're starting to realize, as you talked about earlier, Steve, that, or I believe it was Steve you talked about it, that, every image, everything that's out there in the history of the brand is somehow contributing to how people are thinking going forward. I just have a couple of questions, because it seems like we could talk.
Can I just respond to that for one second, if that's okay?
Sure.
If it's okay.
Sure.
So just I think it's important. I do find that marketers have a reflexive reaction to, like, this is about brand building, and brand building becomes this unassailable thing that we do that is not accountable in any way, to sort of ROI metrics or things like that. I don't like the gross ROIs where we just try to look at marketing spend versus sales, but I also don't like this concept of just strategic brand building, because it's too amorphous. Okay. And so what we've got to say, like, what does it mean to have a brand? What does it mean to have a brand? And I quite like the notion that brand building is about having some, both either space within the cognition of my brain, so like a space in my memory, or a space in my behavioral habits, right? Nothing really matters. Like, loving a brand doesn't matter unless it translates into behavior that's advantageous. And so I think less about measuring things like awareness and again, measuring the behavior that matters. So do I recall it? Am I in the consideration set? Or do I behave consistently by repeating that behavior as a habit over time? That, to me, is the strength of a brand. And this is why I think marketing and strategy are very, they're the same thing in my standpoint. It's like, we're going to make choices that drive customers' behavior. And what we really care about is not whether how they feel about us emotionally, unless that's the thing that drives their behavior. But what we really care at the end of the day is the behavior itself. When they go to buy a new car, do they come and repeat? Do they look at the same car that they've always had, or do they shop around? That's a behavior expression. And so I think that's the thing we're driving for, as opposed to sheer loving it and love of the brand. And some brands get that well because you complement that with your business model in addition to just your marketing spend.
I agree with you. There's so many things popping up into my mind right now. For example, one thing is the latest meaningful brand study from Havas came out this summer, and it did talk about, and again, I might not have the statistic exactly correct, but 4 out of 5 people wouldn't care if 75% of brands disappeared tomorrow. And that's a pretty extraordinary statistic. And I think that within the 17 years that they've been doing the study, that's been the highest, let's call it an apathy score or a disinterest score that they've ever seen. And I think that the marketing community is now at a point where they're trying to grapple with, for lack of a better word, meaning, because they've been through the purpose-driven phase during COVID and some of the obvious things, and now they're really trying to figure out where they go next. I heard Todd Kaplan, who's the CMO of Kraft Heinz, speak recently, and he talked about. It was an interesting argument, I thought. He talked about brand building being a lot like pointillism, the obvious, the French style of painting, and how each of the dots is an image, an impression, an experience, an association that you've had with a brand over time. And how that all leads to a picture of whether that will be a brand that you choose, which I find, quite fascinating and probably right. And it makes it very hard to change behavior when you've got all those dots leading in one direction. So I'm to bring it back to Hone. I think that this book is just so important right now in terms of what is going on in marketing. I'd love you to talk a little bit more about that if you can. I, of course, was also going to mention that you run the sustainability practice. So how we're going to fit all this in 30 minutes is amazing to me. But just roll with me for a minute and just talk about, where you see it going, or maybe if you had an advice for a marketer, where should they start to hone? And I know you've talked about this a little bit, but let's just get really tactical now and just say, where do you start with all these issues that they're dealing with?
So I think if I had to boil it down to the central advice, it's understand what drives the economics of your business. And when I say that, I mean what behaviors drive the economics of your business, and start there. Ultimately, working on the periphery and not focusing on the core issues that people actually care about, which in most profit-oriented companies are the things that drive the economics of the business, is just that's not the best use of time. We do, in the book, we start to imagine what it would look like if we got really good at honing within our own organizations. What would it look like if we could apply some of the same principles to bigger cross-organizational challenges? Both Steve and I, as you mentioned, both of us do a lot of work in the sustainability space these days. I happen to focus in sustainability for energy, which is all about energy transition. And that, by definition, we are not going to get to a place where we have abundant energy and meet all the needs that are being created for energy these days, whether it's AI data centers or anything else, unless we take an approach which is about an all of the above strategy to drive energy creation. And we are never going to get to all of the above and the standing up of all the different types of energy production that we need unless we get people to start to behave differently and run their interconnected management systems differently than they have historically. And so in some ways, I think the impact of Hone will be much greater if we can apply it to those cross-organizational processes and management systems than just within the organization. That said, we're not going to be able to do it cross-organization unless we could get good at it within our organizations. And to bring it back to the marketer, I think what it takes to hone the mindset, the way that we look at human behavior, the way to think about using management systems at our disposal to impact that behavior, the best people in the organization at that today are marketers. And so the question in my mind is, how can marketers act as a force for good to go and accomplish everything else in their organization that needs to be accomplished, both on a standalone basis to drive the economics of that business, or more broadly on kind of inter-organizational challenges?
Yeah, and I'm going to pick up and maybe go back to the study and say it actually isn't surprising to me that we're seeing more what you described as apathy, but I would actually describe it less as consumer apathy and put the onus back on marketers. We are creating less differentiation. And I think what marketers have done, we haven't given consumers a reason not to be apathetic. And I think that's an indictment of not just the marketing community, but of the broader community. But it's also the nature of technology today. Price and value discovery is almost immediate now. Whereas before, you might have to try a product, repeat it, try a different one, and it became the barriers to actually understanding the different price value relationships of different products or services or brands, that took a long time. And so therefore, people might have been more loyal or less apathetic towards brands, but now they're in a sea of sameness because we haven't given them a reason. And we've also, to some extent, my own observation is that we've given marketers or brand owners less of the necessary tools within their portfolio of things that are required to create differentiation. So remember, I'm a 4 Ps marketer, not a, marketing as like advertising spend. So I think about marketing as the equivalent of strategy. So what's the product or service you're offering? Well, how is that different than others? Does that exist at a great price point? Where are you selling it through? Is it convenient for your customers? Like, those are the tools of differentiation. And what we've seen is the onslaught of models that are simpler for customers, like the subscription model. You get them to behave once, and then it's harder to leave your brand. So it's not that it doesn't come back to them loving your brand. It's about the behaviors. And we figured out tools in the context of business models to make it simpler to gain advantage and to keep that advantage because of habit and understanding the way the human brain works and the way behavior works. So my advice to marketers to hone is to really focus on that behavior, intervene at that, and really measure the behavior. And, don't worry about, it's not about your marketing spend, it's about the broader set of tools at your disposal.
I actually think that this is a terrific place to end this, because you're offering some extraordinary information, and I think you've gotten people thinking. I, of course, am curious if there'll be a 4th book, because I might want to know what that is.
So Deb, let's just be clear that we're speaking to each other on November 20th. The last book came out on October 21st, and as much as we like hanging out together, we both need a bit of a cooling off period before we ever declare what's next. Yeah. So we shall see is the answer.
Well, look, I do hope that we can talk further about this and a number of other topics that will certainly be trending. You have been terrific. Thank you so much for sharing those insights, and it's really been a pleasure to host you both. Thank you.
Thank you for having us. Yeah, thank you. It was fun.
The Internationalist focuses on the continual reinvention of marketing by highlighting inspirational marketers around the world and their ideas as they move the industry forward. Internationalist Marketing TV shares these perspectives through interviews and personal stories. Thanks so much for watching. If you find this kind of content helpful, please click like or subscribe. Again, thanks so much.